2024 presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. condemned Hamas's attacks against Israel. The insurgent candidate, who's gained support in part for his anti-war views, turned heads with a statement signaling the U.S. should help Israel defend itself, providing whatever aid they need. On Saturday, he took to Twitter, writing, quote, "As president, I'll make sure that our policy is unambiguous so that the enemies of Israel will think long and hard before attempting aggression of any kind." Political commentator and friend of the show, Sabrina Salvati, called out RFK Jr.'s apparent change of heart, responding on X, quote, "I guess RFK Jr. won't run with the Libertarian Party."
And in fact, she's not just referencing that abstractly, as you see in that tweet. The Libertarian Party responded with a pretty pointed, harsh rebuke of RFK Jr.'s stance there. On the other hand, independent candidate Cornel West stood steadfastly for peace, writing on Twitter that if he were commander-in-chief, he would, quote, "stop the killing of innocent people, be they Palestinians or Israelis, by calling for an end to the vicious U.S.-supported Israeli occupation. This violent resistance to oppression is the desperate language of an occupied people," he wrote. "As I have said for the past 50 years, a precious Palestinian child has the same value as a precious Israeli child." Yeah, going through all of these responses, so much of the discourse on Twitter, at least over the weekend, was people weighing in on who did a better or worse job of acknowledging the tragedy of the moment, acknowledging the value of the Israeli lives lost without that seeming to somehow invalidate or outweigh the ongoing conditions that Palestinians have been living under, which in the views of, I think, most people who are looking in a clear-eyed way at this crisis are, of course, the root causes of why this violence has emerged.
Right. So there are a number of things I wanted to say. So sure. I think you're right. I think it's correct to criticize the media, the mainstream media in general, for overlooking the plight of the Palestinians, for not giving it the coverage it deserves. That's something we've tried to remedy on our own show time and time again. There are the policies of Israel toward the Palestinians I don't agree with, and actually even a lot of the guests we've had on talking about the horrors Israel has faced during this attack, agree with that as well. Now, I don't want that to be used as a way to invalidate the horror of what's happening to the people in Israel, you know, including people at a kind of music festival or something being taken prisoner, killed, possibly raped, their corpses dragged through the streets. The videos we're seeing, totally horrible. So I think it's absolutely correct to condemn what's going on. Then, you know, that's one aspect of it. But honestly, rather than like litigating the Israeli-Palestinian struggle, dispute, battle, mutual hatred, is it proper for the U.S. to put its thumbs on the scales of that conflict one way or the other? And I think the clear answer to that is no. I think often the elites in both parties don't understand that their actual voters, the actual people, don't want their money being sent into these fraught conflicts either way. And so it was disheartening for me to see so many, you know, political figures who identify themselves both as Republican, as Democrat, and as independent, like RFK Jr., signaling. I mean, they want to. All the people complaining that we don't have a speaker and that's preventing us from sending more of our money more immediately to Israel. Is that actually what voters care about and want? I don't think so. So, you know, the same way you and I talk about Ukraine with great sympathy for what the Ukrainian people are facing, with great condemnation of the illegal actions of Russia, but does it serve U.S. foreign policy interests to intervene and to prioritize funding of one side of that conflict? Again, so many Republican primary voters and viewers and the common man saying, no, we don't want to do that. And I suspect that's going to be the case here as well. And Democratic, Republican elites, and also independent candidates should. I'm no secret. I'm a Libertarian Party voter. I think the statements they've put out so far have been very wise, and warning people not to go against this. The anti-interventionist tide is meaningful, and it's because there's a lot of skepticism that our dollars spent over there, regardless of where the over there is, make us safer or make the conflict better. There's profound skepticism of that, and it is well-justified skepticism.
Yeah, I mean, what is it, $3 billion a year as a routine course of action from the United States to Israel. Many on the left have for years been frustrated that Israelis get universal health care, Americans don't. This is another example, it seems, where there's a willingness to do foreign spending in a way that there is not an appetite to do domestic spending. It's a bipartisan effort and a bipartisan interest, and it's something that, again, is framed as in the broader national interest of Americans to protect this, what's described as bastion of democracy in the Middle East. The problem is that $3 billion a year is also funding and facilitating inhumane apartheid conditions for Palestinians, who I cannot describe as Palestinian citizens because they don't have that right. And part of the reason why Cori Bush's statement, I think, was considered to be one of the best of the leftists in Congress is because she does acknowledge that. In the second to last sentence, she says, after, of course, speaking to the tragedy of the lives lost, both Israeli and Palestinian, says, as part of achieving a just and lasting peace, we must do our part to stop this violence and trauma by ending U.S. government support for Israeli military occupation and apartheid. I think that she was the only elected who has been willing to use the word apartheid. And I do think that there's a really short-sightedness here. If you condemn this violence, as everybody should, if you condemn the murder of innocent civilians, as everybody should, at a certain point, you have to figure out what is going to lead people to no longer want to lash out in this way. What do you expect people who are living within policed borders, who are not allowed the free right of egress and ingress, who are, have their water and electricity supply completely controlled by Israel, aren't treated to the democratic process, mass unemployment, mass food insecurity and water insecurity and the like, to live in those conditions for what? For how many more generations? Some of the statements that we've seen reflect an acknowledgement, a recognition that this is an extreme uphill battle. The idea of a direct military conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, as well-funded and technologically advanced as Israelis are, that it's an uphill battle that is unlikely to be successful. It is very likely, and we've seen this already, to bring down a hailstorm of horror on Palestinians. But if you feel like your back up is against the wall and the only alternative is to live successive generations in unsustainable, apartheid, inhumane conditions, then people are willing to take that chance.
Well, I think we should be clear. I don't know that the range of options that the Israeli government could engage in, like Hamas, I don't know that Hamas is going to stop targeting or attacking Israelis regardless of what the situation is. But that doesn't. But my interest is what serves U.S. foreign policy, and the people in the past, the terrorist attacks against the U.S. have been in part justified, and the terrorists justified and garner support for it, because of our policy vis-a-vis Israel, our endorsement and our funding toward Israel. So given that I don't actually think that suits our interests to be seen as antagonistic to people in that corner of the world, and given that I don't think the American people support our money being spent there when there's all sorts of domestic issues going on, it seems like a no-brainer to me to not get additionally involved. I think the policies of the Israeli government toward the Palestinians can be criticized. At the same time, of course, the terrorist attacks by Palestinian radical groups that include abductions and rape and murder and parading around on social media.
It's worth saying there's been no substantiated evidence of rape.
Okay, it's pretty bad what I'm seeing. If that particular allegation doesn't pan out, fine. But again, the point is not, from my standpoint, maybe we disagree on this, but it's not what is going to about the actual conflict there. It's what business does the U.S. have in trying to solve, like, does our money help solve it? Does us weighing in help fix the problem? I see no evidence that we're making things better, and American people don't want to spend our money in foreign countries anyway. Why would we do that? Why is the entire political system we're going to rush the race for the next Speaker of the House process to make sure we can send more American dollars overseas? This is exactly why the elites are out of touch with the American people, that they don't understand at all what the people actually want.
I do think that that's right. I would only add to that our dollars, I think, are in fact fomenting this crisis, are exacerbating this crisis, because our American dollars are what enable the Israeli government, which is a right-wing, increasingly right-wing government, to act with impunity toward an occupied population that they have complete and total dominion over.
Sure. I mean, I think a blood feud between two groups of people who've been living on the same land, not just for decades, but actually for hundreds and thousands of years, can never easily be solved, and there will over the accumulation of thousands of years, there's obviously going to be a lot of wrongdoing on both sides, and it's meant, well, are you accountable for what your immediate ancestors did versus your long ago ancestors?
Well, this isn't. I think people want to turn this into this long ago thing, the way we talk about slavery. Like, why are you still complaining it was 400 years ago? But it wasn't. These are people who are living human beings that can walk by and point to a house that they lived in, that their family grew up in, that they were displaced from, and that now an immigrant from Brooklyn or Baltimore or Germany now lives in and has legal right to for reasons.
Right.
And so that's the situation. I mean, that is the reality of the situation that we're in. Well, there are stories, I mean, in the last month, I've seen, we didn't necessarily cover them here, stories of the Israeli government choosing to poison wells to further limit access to water, again, to be able to have control over what Palestinians do within the very narrow confines of the territory that they're now squatting in Gaza. The complete control. What does it say about the conditions and the rights and freedoms and self-determination that Palestinians have if in the middle of this conflict, a million children are now without water and electricity because the Israeli government can decide to turn it off? Now, that's everybody living in Gaza who's down under those conditions. And you can say, well, if they didn't like it, they should have said something to Hamas. But if you believe that Hamas is a terrorist group, and you believe that Hamas is also not an elected Democratic Party that is reflecting the interests or the choices of the innocent people that are living in Gaza, you also have to be serious about whether or not Israel's response, bombing that tall residential building that we've seen played over and over again as we talk about this issue today, is a ethical and humanitarian response to what has happened.
Every action on both sides is a response to the other thing the other people did, going back all of human history. So, I mean, it sounds, I get both sides or whatever, but it is the case that a lot of bad actions are being taken both by the Israeli government and by a terrorist group that's abducting people off the streets. And we need to move beyond the framing that it is the U.S. government's obligation to solve tensions that predate civilization with American tax dollars. Well, that's the only part I have any expertise in weighing in.
I also don't want to overstate that. I think that there have been many long periods of peaceful coexistence of Arabs, Christians, and Jews in the region, and the issue becomes when there is a state that is established, and I'm not a fan of theocracies, whether they be Muslim, Christian, Jewish, or whatever, but when there's a state that is established on the basis that it's going to grant special rights and interests to one group of people because of their religious background, and that means, by definition, that it's going to be a two-tiered hierarchical system of governance that is going to disadvantage people who are Palestinian, who are Arab, who are Christian, and who are Muslim. And that is why it has been described by Amnesty International and any number of respected international groups as an apartheid state. And that is the fundamental issue. To say, occupied people have a right to resist as well. Israel has a right to defend itself, but that gets said a million times on TV every single day. What never gets said is that Occupy people have a right to exist, and that means violence. And I don't support violence. I agree with Cori Bush and others who have called for peace. But that peace is going to have to be conditioned on the resolution of the underlying conflict that the occupied people have been trying to peacefully protest. There was this peaceful protest that I mentioned in an earlier segment that resulted in them getting their Israeli soldiers shooting at the feet and hitting some of the protesters. You have non-violent movements like BDS, Boycott, Divest, and Sanction, being characterized as terroristic in and of themselves. You have conservatives in this country who value free speech, making it so that if you support BDS, you aren't able to get a government contract in this country. So if all of those peaceful ways are not good enough,
well, the violent ways aren't going to achieve anything other than retaliatory violence on the populace.
Well, then there are people who are willing to risk that because that's how they feel about their conditions. And so I do think we have a clip of Jeremy Corbyn's response. I saw his Twitter response. I think was one of the best ones that I think addressed the underlying issues the best. But let's take a look at what he had to say.
Yesterday, I sent out a statement calling for a ceasefire, calling for peace, and calling for an end to the occupation of Palestine, which, of course, is fundamentally the background to the whole issue. Obviously, all attacks are wrong.
But do you condemn Hamas?
I think I've made my point.
Well, no, you haven't quite made the point. Lots of people.
Wait a minute. You love interrupting people when they're trying to answer a question, don't you? Now, to say it for the third time, then. Yesterday, I sent out a statement which made it very clear I wanted peace.
And you see the kind of pushback that you get for saying that. Like, people are acting as though it's like both sides. You know, why won't you condemn the violence against Israelis? There's no hesitation to condemn violence against innocents in any way. But when you're seeing in the weight of the coverage and the emphasis in words like brutality and barbarism, et cetera, and also the complete indifference to when the very same picture that people thought was an Israeli kid in a cage suddenly becomes a Palestinian kid in a cage, all of that umbrage dissipates.
But what's
wrong? When you try to address the underlying concerns, you see the kind of pushback Corbyn got from a pretty neutral statement that says killing is wrong, killing violence against civilians is wrong, and to end this violence, we have to address the root causes.
Yeah, I agree that the indifference to the plight of the Palestinians is wrong and is overlooked by our one-sided media constantly, and that should be called out and corrected. But I would fix this hypocrisy by calling more attention to the suffering of the Palestinian people, not like downplaying or saying, oh, you shouldn't say it's barbarism. So, like we saw the videos of the attacks. They're horrible. They're awful.
That's fine. If you're willing to say that it's also barbaric, the way that the government of Israel has been treating Palestinians.
Yeah, I'm perfectly willing to say that, and more.
We are, Robbie, but unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the discourse more broadly. But stick with us. We'll have more Rising for you right after this.